coming out to support Gus in his oral today? I have a quick prayer to get things started off right. On the panel, we have Mr. Miller, Mr. Faria, and myself. I'm Mrs. Telshow. So let's pray. Heavenly King, thank you for this day. Thank you for our MCA family. Thank you for Gus. And thank you for these seniors who have contributed so much to us this year. We pray for strength, wisdom, and courage. And most of all, we honor your most holy name. Amen.
There is a decline. This is a decline in America, and it involves a waning appreciation of American patriotism. It is a departure from the basic principles set by our founding fathers, fundamentally understood love of country and patriotic self-sacrifice. This decline is evidenced by the number of volunteers in our military, our country's just go along with it attitude, and a passive attitude towards blatant foreign threats made against our nation. Teddy Roosevelt described patriotism when he said, "Patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president or any other official, save to the exact degree in which he himself stands by the country. It is unpatriotic not to oppose him to the exact extent that by inefficiency of otherwise he fails in his duty to stand by the country." Being patriotic is a burdensome obligation one bears. It means being involved in something other than oneself. The Webster's Dictionary, 1961 edition, defines patriotism as love of country, devotion to the welfare of one's country. This love or respect of country is fading from our nation and evolving into a tolerance for country. No longer are people looking forward and seeing how decisions made today will affect the country 20 years from now. They tolerate what they must now so that they can survive now. So why should we be concerned about our decline in patriotism? What relevance does this decline have to the average American man? And what does it matter that people don't appreciate their country's history or culture? The answer is simple. A decline in patriotism will not only affect patriotism, but its effects will be far more long-reaching. If a man will not stand in defense of his nation, then for whom or what will he or she stand? Patriotism will not be the end of this decline. If a man will not respect his nation, then what will he respect? C.S. Lewis touched on this when he stated, "Where men are forbidden to honor a king, they honor millionaires, athletes, or film stars instead, even famous prostitutes and gangsters. For spiritual nature, like bodily nature, will be served. Deny it food, and it will gobble poison." Of course, C.S. Lewis was a professor of medieval studies. When he spoke of king, he was speaking of the nation. Since to an Englishman, the king was the ultimate representation of a country's character. A bad or corrupt king would affect the populace, and that he would set the tone for the entire culture. If you doubt this, just look at the traditional white wedding dress and decorated Christmas tree brought to us by Queen Victoria and her consort, Prince Albert. This may seem a somewhat skewed way to define a nation, but it is relevant. Ice cream was made popular by Dolly Madison, and we have the teddy bear. So Americans can hardly say that our leaders don't affect our American values. We are influenced by the qualities of our leaders. If we have a weak leader, we have a weak America. Patriotism is just the tip of the iceberg. This is what is happening to our nation. This has happened to many other nations throughout history. In Rome, a deterioration of Roman patriotism, an increased focus on the games and fun in the Colosseum marked a shift in traditional Roman values. Basically, Roman patriotism lost ground to new Roman values: self-preservation and personal indulgence. One can almost see the shift in priorities among the Roman populace. What began as a handful of celebratory Roman games a year grew to over 170 games a year. This shift also marked the end of Roman military dominance in the ancient world. leading inevitably to the fall of a 1,200-year-old empire. What happened and what caused the Roman Empire to fall so dramatically? Rome's fall was a result of apathy and weakened patriotism that resulted in a decline in morality and of concern for the empire. Romans watched and let it fall apart. Towards the end of the Roman Empire, the once proud Roman army relied upon barbarians to do the fighting, while the populace gathered to watch games and enjoy the circus. Romans who had died to defend the Roman way of life because they believed in it no longer had concern for the world around them. They partied and let their empire be ripped apart by the very barbarians they had hired to defend it. The last Roman emperor was a child who ran for his life when the barbarians approached Rome. Shameful behavior, cowardice, and love of self were the new Roman values. These Roman values are in direct contradiction with what Plato taught and wrote in his Republic. Plato thought that a leader should be more concerned with the concerns of the nation than his own fame, profit, or any other form of self-gain. 1,500 years after the fall of Rome, one only wonders how many people even take notice of what is happening in Washington, D.C., and how many young people of voting age limit their education to YouTube videos. Like the Romans, Americans are participating in their decline. When the populace ceases to be forward-looking, they seek to serve themselves. Like Rome, this is a recipe for disaster. If the American people are becoming apathetic about patriotism, then the natural progression of this will mean that they become more self-serving. Instead of service before self, it becomes service to self. Americans will develop a get-by attitude. When one just gets by, then one tolerates. When one tolerates, then one ceases to stand up for one's moral values and begins to value passive acceptance. We hear this all the time on the TV and media. The idea of live and let live just about as long as it does not interfere with my life. We as Americans must be concerned about our decline in patriotism, because no matter how tall one is or how strong one is, once Americans lose their patriotism, they will lose their American values. America will cease to be great because the people do not care about the society as a whole. We can see a good example of this shift in patriotism in the intervening years of Pearl Harbor and 9/11. On December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, there was an attack upon a military base that cost the lives of 2,402 individual servicemen. In a matter of weeks, the United States military grew from a tiny 500,000 strong force to a 17 million strong force that would eventually dominate and win the war. Everyone was upset about the Pearl Harbor attacks. People still talk about it today. Back then, a generation was mobilized, and Pearl Harbor was not even on the continental U.S. After 9/11, which was an attack upon a defenseless civilian population that took the lives of 2,977 people in the heart of New York City, the United States military did not budge from 2.5 million soldiers. Not the marked change in 1941. Although there were many who enlisted after the attacks, there were as many or more who did nothing or perhaps even left military service. There are still those who say that war is just too risky. After all, who really wants to go to Afghanistan? Basically, something has happened to our patriotism. The difference is that in 1941, the people thought it unacceptable to be attacked in such an underhanded manner. In 2001, an attack which cost more lives than Pearl Harbor did cause mass mourning, but did not provoke the same patriotic response with regards to the insults upon the American way of life. The same President Bush, who received a standing ovation when he called for war, received vicious attacks just a few years later. Why were Americans more inclined to accept the 9/11 attacks when, if anything, it was a larger assault upon freedom and liberty than Pearl Harbor was? I doubt the greatest generation would have tolerated as much. What has happened to our love of country? Why do Americans look the other way when our freedoms are threatened? Our founding fathers fought a revolution over less. In World War II, The people knew that great sacrifice was needed immediately in order to secure and preserve American freedoms. Perhaps people today just don't see it this way. Decline in patriotism means there's less love and more tolerance for the nation. After World War II, there was a rebellion. The age of rock and roll, with its many awesome songs, began to attack the manly respect that patriotism relies upon. And it was cool to have tolerance for all people and all things. And I don't care attitude developed, and it was cool to tolerate just about anything. G.K. Chesterton commented on this type of tolerance and said that tolerance is the virtue of a man without conviction. A man without conviction does not care about his neighbor, much less what happens to his nation. This is what is happening to our nation. The idea of doing what one must do because it is good and virtuous is a fading value among Americans today. This I don't care attitude does not just affect the military capabilities of the nation. It also affects the government and how the nation is run. A decline in voters affects the lives of those who live in the nation. In the age of rock and roll, in between the 1972 and 1976 election, the amount of voters plummeted. In between these two elections, the amount of voters plummeted 10%. In between the 1980 and 1984 election, the amount of registered voters plummeted from 87 to 67%. A decline in voters shows that we have less patriotism for our nation because patriotic people care about their nation. When there is a decline in voters, it is easier for those with ill intentions and questionable morals to get into influential positions into the government. This is an obvious trend. Look at the Watergate events in the 1970s when President Richard Nixon was in the process of being impeached. Nixon resigned, not because he wiretapped one room, but because he looked the other way. Then the 1990s, and Clinton escaped impeachment. By 2013, politicians talk about wiretapping the entire nation, yet these actions seldom make the nightly news. In less than a generation, there has been an increase of tolerance and a decrease in love for country that would not have been acceptable a mere 60 years ago. Don't tread on me. Nathan Hale's love of country and commitment to the American values are slipping. The patriots of the American Revolution certainly had more than a just-get-by attitude, and they would have understood the idea we must not stand still and let our enemies do that again. The enemies of America no longer wear uniforms, but they continue to seek the destruction of the American way of life. They pervade our media, affect our values, and rejoice as Americans grow apathetic about their government and their traditional American values. The solution to the problem is not an easy one, but patriotism must be recovered. We have a lot to be proud of in this country. Stand when the flag goes past you. Shake a veteran's hand and appreciate our traditional self-governance. And this is how we can show our love of country. This is how we young people can help our country survive in what is, after all, not a perfect world. Thank you for listening.